My aunt accidentally sent me a family group chat of them laughing and calling me lonely and pathetic, while I paid all their bills for 8 years, saying she only has her money. So I stayed silent until the next payment was due and cut them off completely. But I wasn't done yet. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Emma Carter. I'm 37 years old, and for most of my adult life, I thought I was doing exactly what a good daughter and sister was supposed to do. I worked as a payroll manager for a logistics company. I liked numbers because they made sense. Problems had causes. Payments had records. Everything could be tracked. People were harder, especially family. Most mornings started the same way: coffee, emails, payroll reports. Then my phone would buzz. Usually, it was my mom. "Hey, sweetheart, call me when you get a minute." Nothing dramatic, just normal. When I called her that morning, she sounded cheerful. "I just got the mortgage statement," she said. I already knew where this was going. "I'm a little short this month." That phrase had been part of my life for years. "How much?" she told me. I opened my banking app immediately. "I'll take care of it." "Oh, honey, thank you." "No problem." And I meant it. After my dad passed away years earlier, everyone struggled in different ways. Mom had the house. My younger sister Rachel was trying to finish a school. My older brother Jason seemed to run into financial trouble every few months. I had the most stable job, so I helped. A few hours later, Jason called. "My insurance premium went up again." "Of course it did," I joked. "How much are you short?" He told me. "I sent the money before dinner." "You're a lifesaver," he said. "No, I'm just your sister." "Same thing." We laughed. A few days later, Rachel called. "My tuition payment is due Friday." "You need help?" She hesitated. "I hate asking." "I know. I'll pay you back." "Focus on school." The relief in her voice made the decision easy. That was how I viewed all of it. I wasn't keeping score. When someone I loved needed help and I could provide it, I did. Simple as that. The weeks kept moving. Work stayed busy. Family stayed busy. There was always something: a repair, a bill, an unexpected expense. Nothing huge on its own. Just a steady stream of problems that somehow always found their way to me. One Saturday, I went to my mom's house for dinner. Rachel talked about classes. Jason complained about work. Mom made sure everyone had enough food. For a while, everything felt normal. Then the conversation drifted toward money, like it usually did. Rising costs, textbooks, home repairs. Nobody asked me for anything directly, but somehow I left knowing exactly who needed help next. While we cleaned up afterward, Mom smiled and said, "You work too much." "You say that every week." "Because it's true," I laughed. "And yet nobody tells me to work less when a bill shows up." She smiled. "That's different." Then she changed the subject. A few days later, I was making dinner when Mom called again. I could hear family members in the background. We chatted for a few minutes before someone mentioned a bill. Mom answered immediately. "Oh, it'll be okay." A few people laughed. Then she said, "I don't know what we'd do without Emma." More laughter followed. Someone said, "Seriously?" I laughed too. It sounded like the kind of thing families say, the kind of thing I'd heard before. But after the call ended, I found myself staring at my phone a little longer than usual. I don't know what we'd do without Emma. I tried not to think too much about that phone call. People say things like that all the time. "I don't know what we'd do without you." It sounded like appreciation, maybe even affection. So I pushed it aside and went back to my routine. Work was busy enough to help with that. Payroll was entering one of its heavier cycles, and when you're responsible for making sure hundreds of people get paid correctly, there's not a lot of room left in your brain for overanalyzing family conversations. At least that's what I told myself. By Thursday afternoon, I was staring at spreadsheets when my phone lit up. A family group text. Nothing unusual. Rachel had sent a photo of her campus after a rainstorm. My mom replied with 3 heart emojis. Jason immediately changed the subject. Anybody know a good mechanic? That got everyone's attention. What happened now? Mom asked. My truck's making a weird noise. A weird noise doesn't sound expensive, Rachel joked. Jason replied with a laughing emoji. Then he wrote, That's exactly what the mechanic said before the last repair cost me $1,200. A few jokes followed. The conversation moved on. But for some reason, I noticed something. Nobody asked how Jason planned to handle it. Nobody suggested a budget. Nobody offered solutions. The topic simply floated there for a while before disappearing, the same way these conversations always seem to disappear. That evening, I met my family for a small birthday dinner for one of my cousins. Nothing formal, just a crowded restaurant, too much food, and relatives talking over each other. The kind of gathering we'd had for years. For a while, everything felt easy. People talked about vacations, kids, sports, work. Then somehow the conversation drifted again. Not dramatically, just naturally, like it always did. My mother mentioned property taxes. Rachel mentioned rising tuition costs. Jason brought up the truck again. My Aunt Linda complained about grocery prices. Nobody was asking me for anything. Nobody even looked at me when they talked about money. That was the strange part. It wasn't a request. It was more like an announcement. As if everyone was simply placing information on the table. I found myself listening more than talking. Jason shook his head. I swear, every month something breaks. You've always had bad luck with vehicles, Mom said. No kidding. Maybe it's time for a newer truck, someone suggested. Jason laughed. Sure. Anybody got 30 grand? Everyone laughed. I laughed too. But I noticed something else. Nobody ever talked about responsibility. Nobody talked about long-term plans. Nobody asked questions like, how are we going to fix this? What's the backup plan? How can we prevent this next time? Problems appeared. Then somehow they disappeared. And I honestly couldn't remember when I stopped noticing that pattern. At one point, Rachel turned to me. How's work? Busy. Still doing payroll? Still payroll. You actually like that stuff? I smiled. I like knowing where things stand. Jason laughed. That's because you're the organized one. Somebody has to be. Definitely not me. More laughter. The conversation moved on. A few years earlier, I would have jumped in with suggestions, budgeting ideas, ways to save money, offers to help. That night, I mostly listened. Not because I was upset. Not because I was making some big statement. I just wasn't in the mood to solve everyone's problems before dessert. That was new. The dinner ended with hugs, leftovers, and promises to get together again soon. Completely normal. Completely uneventful. At least on the surface. Back home, I changed into sweatpants, answered a few work emails, and forgot about the truck conversation entirely. Friday morning came fast. Meetings, payroll approvals, a dozen small fires to put out. By lunchtime, I was finally catching my breath when my phone buzzed. Jason. I smiled automatically and opened the message. For a second, I thought he was just checking in. Instead, I saw a screenshot, an estimate from a repair shop. Then another message appeared. Hey, Em. A few seconds later. Any chance you could help me out with this? I stared at the screen. The truck. The same truck he'd mentioned at dinner less than 24 hours earlier. The same problem he'd casually brought up in front of everyone. I scrolled back through the family chat, then back to the estimate, then back to his message. My phone buzzed again. Jason was typing. Jason's next message popped up almost immediately. Honestly, anything helps. I looked at the repair estimate for a few seconds, then typed the same thing I'd typed dozens of times before. How much do you need? The answer came fast. He already knew exactly what amount he wanted me to cover. I transferred the money and went back to work. A minute later, another message arrived. Thanks, Em. I owe you. The strange thing was, I wasn't annoyed, but I kept thinking about that dinner conversation. The truck problem had been mentioned casually in front of everyone. Less than a day later, I was paying for it. The pattern suddenly felt easier to see. A few weeks passed. Work, bills, family calls, the usual. Then my mom called one Sunday afternoon. The water heater finally gave out. Completely? Completely. Have you gotten an estimate yet? Not yet, but they're all expensive. I knew what that meant. A few hours later, Rachel called about a gap in her financial aid. 2 days after that, Jason needed help with an insurance deductible. None of those situations seemed unreasonable by themselves. Life happened. What bothered me was something else. Nobody ever talked about solutions beyond the immediate crisis. Nobody discussed sharing costs. Nobody talked about long-term plans. The goal always seemed to be surviving the next problem. One evening, I opened the family group chat while eating dinner. Everyone was discussing Mom's water heater. Suggestions flew back and forth. Get another estimate. Try the company Jason used. Maybe wait until next month. Then the conversation stalled. I typed, "What if we all contribute something?" The chat went quiet. Not awkward, just quiet. A minute later, Rachel replied, "That's not a bad idea." Jason added a thumbs up. Mom never responded. Instead, everyone started talking about a TV show. Just like that, the water heater disappeared from the conversation. A few days later, I tried again during lunch with Mom, Jason, and Rachel. What would happen if we made a plan for these expenses instead of handling them one at a time? Jason laughed. That sounds suspiciously like homework. I'm serious. So are spreadsheets involved? Rachel asked. I already have spreadsheets. That got a laugh. For a second, I thought we might actually discuss it. Then Mom waved her hand. We'll figure things out. That's kind of my point, I said. We never really do. Nobody argued. Nobody got angry. But the energy shifted. Jason focused on his drink. Rachel checked her phone. Mom stared into her coffee. Finally, she smiled. We don't need to solve everything today. And that was the end of the conversation. The strange part was how familiar it felt. Driving home, I realized I'd had versions of that discussion before. Different years, different problems, same outcome. Whenever I suggested budgeting, planning ahead, or dividing responsibilities, everyone agreed in theory. Then nothing happened. At one family barbecue, I suggested a shared emergency fund. Everyone loved the idea. Nobody contributed. Another time, I offered to help create budgets. Everyone said yes. Nobody followed through. The pattern was so predictable I could almost recite the responses. I still believed my family loved me. I still believed they appreciated everything I did. But I was starting to wonder whether anyone expected the situation to ever change. That thought stayed with me through the week. At work, responsibilities belonged to specific people. If something needed to be done, someone owned it. Family didn't seem to work that way. Friday afternoon, I was finishing a report when my phone lit up. I glanced at it, then looked again. The sender wasn't Mom. It wasn't Jason. It wasn't Rachel. It was Aunt Linda. That wasn't unusual. The preview underneath her name was. It wasn't a message. It was an image attachment. Then another notification appeared. Aunt Linda. Oops. I stared at the screen for a second. Aunt Linda wasn't someone who accidentally sent random photos, at least not usually. I tapped the image. At first, I didn't even understand what I was looking at. It was a screenshot, a conversation, A group chat. Not the family group chat I was part of. A different one. The names at the top looked familiar. Mom, Jason, Rachel, Aunt Linda, a few other relatives. My stomach tightened a little. I figured it had to be something harmless. Maybe someone sharing photos. Maybe a conversation about an upcoming family event. Then I started reading. The first few messages weren't important. People talking about bills, a repair, the usual family stuff. Then Jason wrote, "At least Emma will probably cover it if things get ugly." A laughing emoji followed. Someone else reacted with another laughing emoji. I frowned. Not because the comment was mean. It just felt strange seeing it written out so casually, like it wasn't even a question, more like an assumption. I kept scrolling. One of my cousins wrote, "She always does." Jason replied, "Exactly." Then another relative added, "Honestly, I don't think she's capable of saying no." More laughing emojis. I read that line twice, not because it was devastating, because it sounded familiar. People had joked about that before, even in front of me. The difference was that those jokes usually came with a smile, a hug, some kind of appreciation. This felt different. Nobody was talking about how grateful they were. Nobody was talking about how much the help meant. The conversation wasn't about appreciation at all. It was about certainty. The kind of certainty people have when they already know the outcome. I looked up from my phone. The office around me suddenly felt louder. Phones ringing, people talking, keyboards clicking. I could hear everything and nothing at the same time. A new message appeared from Linda. "Sorry, didn't mean to send that." I stared at it, then back at the screenshot, then back at her message. I typed, "No worries." That was it. No questions, no confrontation, nothing. Part of me wanted to believe there was some context I was missing. Maybe the conversation was being taken out of context. Maybe I hadn't seen enough. So I went back to the screenshot and started reading more carefully. A few messages later, someone mentioned Rachel's tuition. One relative asked whether she had figured out how to cover the next semester. Before Rachel could answer, someone else responded, "She doesn't need to. Emma always figures something out." Another laughing emoji, another reaction. Nobody disagreed. Nobody said that wasn't fair. Nobody said maybe Rachel should handle it herself. The assumption was already built into the conversation. Emma will figure it out. Emma will pay. Emma will solve it. I felt uncomfortable. Not angry. Not yet. Just uncomfortable. Like I was reading a conversation that wasn't supposed to sound the way it sounded. I thought about all the times family members had thanked me. Birthdays, holidays, family dinners. There had always been appreciation. At least I thought there had been. But the longer I stared at the screenshot, the more those memories started competing with what was right in front of me. The people in this conversation weren't discussing whether I would help. They were discussing when. That was different. A lot different. I zoomed in on part of the screenshot to make sure I hadn't misunderstood something. The messages became clearer. One cousin joked that I probably had a separate budget category just for family emergencies. Someone else replied, "Honestly, she should." More laughter. Jason added, "Probably does." I actually let out a small laugh. Not because it was funny, because the joke was accidentally true. I did have a folder in my finances for unexpected family expenses. The laugh disappeared almost immediately. The conversation kept going, line after line, comment after comment. Nobody sounded cruel. That was what made it harder to process. If someone had openly insulted me, it would have been easier. Instead, they sounded comfortable. Comfortable assuming my money would always be available. Comfortable planning around it. Comfortable talking about it when I wasn't there. I kept scrolling. Then my thumb stopped. A new name appeared in the conversation. My mother's. I looked at the first line of her message. Then I read it again. And suddenly, I wasn't paying attention to anyone else's comments anymore. My mother's message wasn't long. That was part of what made it hit so hard. A cousin had joked that I would never stop helping because I didn't know how to say no. A few people reacted with laughing emojis. Then Mom replied, "Of course she won't." Another relative asked why, and Mom answered, "Work and taking care of other people's problems is basically her whole life." I just stared at the screen. There wasn't an insult. No name-calling, no anger, nothing openly cruel. The message was written like a simple observation, like she was describing the weather. I read it again, then one more time. I kept waiting for it to sound different, for some hidden meaning to appear, for context I had missed. It never came. A few messages followed after hers. More jokes, a couple laughing emojis. Someone wrote, "That's actually true." Nobody disagreed. Nobody said it was unfair. Nobody jumped in with, "Come on, that's not who Emma is." The conversation simply moved on, like everyone accepted it. That was the part I couldn't stop thinking about. Not the joke. Not even Mom's comment. The silence afterward. Nobody challenged it. Nobody defended me. Nobody seemed uncomfortable. I locked my phone and tried to focus on work. 5 minutes later, I unlocked it and read the screenshot again. For the rest of the afternoon, I kept doing that. Reading, closing it, opening it again. Like I was reviewing a document and trying to find an error. Something that would prove I had misunderstood. By the time I got home, I had already built several explanations in my head. Maybe Mom hadn't meant it that way. Maybe everyone was just joking. Maybe I was tired. Maybe seeing private messages made them seem harsher than they really were. People sound different in group chats. At least that's what I told myself. I ordered takeout that night and spent most of dinner staring at my television without actually watching it. My phone buzzed several times. Family messages, memes, photos, normal conversations. Nobody acted differently. Nobody seemed worried that I had seen the screenshot. Nobody brought it up. Not even Linda. The whole thing felt strangely invisible. A few days passed. I went to work, answered emails, ran payroll, paid bills. Life kept moving. On the surface, nothing had changed. But I started noticing small things. Jason called asking if I knew a cheaper insurance company. Mom texted asking if I had recommendations for a contractor. Rachel needed advice about a payment deadline. None of those conversations involved money directly. Not this time. Still, I found myself paying closer attention, listening differently, looking for something I couldn't quite explain. One evening, Rachel called while I was making dinner. We talked about school for a while. Then she laughed about something one of her professors had said. The conversation felt normal, comfortable. Before hanging up, she said, "Thanks for always helping me." I almost asked her what she meant. Helping with school? Helping financially? Helping in general? The question reached the tip of my tongue. Then I let it go. "Of course," I said. After the call ended, I sat quietly at the kitchen table. The screenshot was still sitting in my phone. I opened it again. Mom's comment seemed smaller every time I looked at it. Yet somehow it hurt more. Not because she thought I worked too much. That part was true. Not because I helped people. That was true too. What hurt was how complete the statement felt. As if that was all she saw. Work. Problems. Money. Nothing else. I thought about vacations I'd postponed. Relationships that never went anywhere because I was always busy. Weekends spent solving someone else's emergency. I'd never really regretted those choices. At least, not before. For years, I believed I was helping my family through a difficult chapter. A temporary situation. something we would eventually move beyond together. The screenshot made me wonder if everyone else saw it differently. Maybe they didn't think the situation was temporary at all. That thought stayed with me for days. I didn't call anyone out. I didn't send angry messages. I didn't confront my mother. Honestly, I wasn't even sure what I would say. Instead, one Friday night, I sat down at my dining table with my laptop. The apartment was quiet. No television, no music, just me. For a few minutes, I stared at the screen without doing anything. Then I logged into my bank account. I clicked on transactions, changed the date range, and started scrolling backward through years of records. I told myself I was only looking for perspective. That was it. Nothing dramatic. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I wasn't trying to prove a point. I just wanted to see the numbers. Maybe because numbers had always made me feel grounded. They didn't care about feelings. They didn't change depending on who was telling the story. A payment was a payment. A transfer was a transfer. A receipt was a receipt. So I started scrolling. At first, I only went back a few months. Mom's mortgage, Jason's insurance, Rachel's tuition, a medical bill, a car repair. Nothing surprising. Then I went back a year. The list got longer. A lot longer. I grabbed a notebook and started writing things down. Just basic categories. Mom, Jason, Rachel. Miscellaneous family expenses. Within 20 minutes, I ran out of space on the page. That was the moment I opened a spreadsheet. The irony wasn't lost on me. Jason's joke about spreadsheets suddenly felt a little less funny. For the next few evenings, that project became my routine. Dinner, a shower, then my laptop. I created folders. One for Mom, one for Jason, one for Rachel, one for everyone else. Bank records became PDFs. Email receipts got downloaded. Old payment confirmations were organized by date. Every time I thought I was finished, I found something else. A forgotten transfer. A utility payment. A tuition deposit. A repair invoice. My inbox turned into a time machine. I started revisiting years I hadn't thought about in a long time. Some transactions brought back memories immediately. Dad's funeral expenses. The first few mortgage payments after he passed away. Rachel's first semester. Jason's car accident. Those made sense. I never questioned those. I would have helped again without hesitation. But then I kept digging, and the pattern became harder to ignore. The one-time emergencies weren't actually one-time emergencies. The same categories kept returning. Car repairs, insurance issues, late bills, housing costs, unexpected fees. The names changed. The explanations changed. The emergencies didn't. One Tuesday night, I was reviewing Jason's folder when I noticed something strange. 3 separate vehicle repairs. Different years. Different vehicles. Almost the exact same explanation. Bad timing. Unexpected expense. Just need a little help. I leaned back in my chair, then checked the dates again. I wasn't looking for evidence. I was looking for accuracy. Unfortunately, the accuracy wasn't helping. The numbers kept growing. Every time I added a new entry, I expected the total to level off. Instead, it climbed. Then climbed again. One weekend, Rachel called while I was working through old records. "Hey, what are you up to?" I glanced at the spreadsheet before answering. "Oh, just organizing some financial stuff." That wasn't technically a lie. "You always do financial stuff." I laughed. Occupational hazard. We talked about school for a few minutes. The conversation was normal, comfortable. But when the call ended, I found myself looking at her folder. For the first time, I wasn't seeing memories. I was seeing patterns. That realization bothered me, because these weren't strangers. This was my family. People I loved. People I'd spent years defending. Yet the more organized everything became, the harder it was to rely on the explanations I had always given myself. The spreadsheet didn't care about intentions. It only showed repetition. A week into the project, my dining table looked ridiculous. Notes, folders, receipts, printed statements, highlighters. The setup looked less like someone's apartment and more like an accountant preparing for an audit, which, in a way, was exactly what I was doing. Just not the kind of audit I'd ever expected. One evening, I finally added up a section I'd been avoiding. I stared at the total, then checked it again, then a third time. Not because the math was wrong, because it wasn't. I slowly closed my eyes. For years, every request had arrived with its own explanation, its own story, its own reason why this particular situation was different. But once all the stories were stripped away, the same thing remained. The emergencies weren't isolated events. They were a system. And for 8 years, I had been the system. I sat there looking at the spreadsheet long after midnight. The screen filled with dates, transfers, invoices, and notes. Hundreds of entries. Years of history. Years of helping. Years of believing things would eventually balance out. Instead, a pattern was staring back at me. And the more complete the records became, the less I could pretend I wasn't seeing it. The spreadsheet kept growing. Every time I thought I had reached the end of it, another transaction showed up. Another transfer. Another payment. Another emergency I had completely forgotten about. At some point, I stopped being surprised by individual expenses. What caught my attention was something else. Responsibility had been moving toward me for years, quietly, almost invisibly. Nobody had ever sat me down and said, "Emma, you're responsible for this now." It happened in smaller ways. A missed payment here, a temporary loan there, an expense someone couldn't cover. Then another, and another. The first time I helped with my mom's mortgage, it was supposed to be temporary. The first tuition payment for Rachel was supposed to be temporary too. The same thing happened with Jason. Almost every responsibility arrived with an expiration date. The expiration date just never came. One afternoon at work, I was reviewing payroll discrepancies. A department manager had submitted incorrect hours for several employees. Nothing unusual. Part of my job was tracking where mistakes started and how they spread. As I worked through the report, a thought hit me. I did this every day for hundreds of employees. I checked records, verified details, looked for patterns, asked questions. But somehow I had never done that with my own life. I had accepted explanations that I would never accept in a payroll audit. Temporary. One time. Just until things improve. The numbers sitting on my dining table told a different story. Those weren't temporary situations. They were recurring expenses with recurring solutions. And I had become the recurring solution. That realization followed me home. So did the spreadsheet. One evening, I was sorting old receipts when my phone buzzed. A text from Aunt Linda. "How are you doing?" I stared at the message. Simple. Normal. Nothing unusual. But since receiving the screenshot, every interaction with her felt different. I replied, "Doing okay. Busy with work." A few minutes later, she responded, "You're always busy." Normally, I would have smiled at that. This time, I found myself thinking about Mom's comment in the screenshot. Work and taking care of other people's problems. I pushed the thought away. Linda and I exchanged a few more messages. She asked about work, asked about a vacation I'd mentioned months earlier, asked whether I was taking enough time for myself. The conversation felt surprisingly easy, comfortable even. What stood out was what she didn't mention. The screenshot. Not once. Not directly. Not indirectly. Nothing. And somehow that made me think about it even more. Because if it had truly been an accident, wouldn't she have explained it? Wouldn't she have apologized again? Wouldn't she have checked whether things were okay? Instead, she acted as though the screenshot had never happened. The more I thought about it, the less accidental it felt. I couldn't prove that. Maybe I was wrong. But the possibility stayed in the back of my mind. Maybe Linda had wanted me to see it. Maybe she was tired of watching the same pattern too. I never asked. And she never offered an explanation. Still, over the following weeks, I found myself talking to her more than usual. Nothing dramatic. Just ordinary conversations. Meanwhile, conversations with everyone else started feeling different. Not hostile, not confrontational, just distant. Jason would tell me about a financial problem and I'd hear the spreadsheet in my head. Mom would mention a bill and I'd remember years of transactions. Rachel would talk about school expenses and I'd find myself mentally organizing them into categories. I hated that. I really did. Because these weren't accounting entries. They were people I loved. But facts have a way of changing how you see things once you've spent enough time looking at them. One Thursday evening, I was making dinner when my phone buzzed. Jason. I didn't need to open the message to know the general topic. I could almost predict it. Sure enough, there was a short explanation about an unexpected expense, followed by a familiar question. Any chance you could help? For years, my response time measured in minutes, sometimes seconds. I would read the message, transfer money, move on. That was the routine. I looked at the text, then set my phone face down on the counter. The pasta water continued boiling. The kitchen remained quiet. A few minutes passed. Then 10. Then 15. My phone buzzed again. Another message. I didn't pick it up. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing to solve the problem. And judging by the second notification lighting up my screen, someone had already noticed. The second notification came from Jason. Just making sure you saw my message. I looked at it, then locked my phone again. That felt strange. Not because I was planning to refuse. I wasn't even sure what I was going to do. I simply wasn't responding immediately. For most people, that wouldn't mean much. For my family, it apparently did. The next morning, my phone buzzed before I finished my first cup of coffee. Jason again. No rush, just trying to figure out my options. I almost laughed at the wording. Not because it was rude, because for the first time I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. His options included me, automatically. By lunchtime, I still hadn't replied. Not out of spite. Honestly, I was busy. Payroll deadlines didn't care about family drama. I spent most of the day reviewing reports and answering questions from department managers. For a few hours, I barely thought about Jason's message. Then my phone rang. Mom. I answered. Hey. Hi, sweetheart. Her voice sounded cheerful, normal. We talked for a minute about work, the weather, a neighbor she'd run into. Then she casually asked, Did you talk to Jason? There it was. Not, how are you? Not, how's your week? Jason. I leaned back in my chair. Not yet. A brief pause. Oh. Then she quickly changed the subject. The call lasted another minute before ending. I stared at my phone after hanging up. The entire conversation had felt oddly efficient, like a check-in disguised as a check-in. That evening, Jason sent another message. Nothing aggressive, nothing dramatic. Just another follow-up, the kind of message that would have seemed completely reasonable a month earlier. Now I found myself reading it differently, not because the words had changed, because I had. The next couple of days followed a similar pattern. Someone always seemed to be checking in. Rachel texted. Mom called. Jason followed up. Nobody sounded angry. Nobody sounded demanding. At least, not yet. But almost every conversation eventually circled back to the same thing. The request, whether directly or indirectly. One Saturday afternoon, I was grocery shopping when Rachel called. Hey, she said. Hey. Everything okay? For a moment, I felt relieved. Someone was finally asking. Yeah, why? Oh, Jason said you've been hard to reach. There it was. Not concern. Information gathering. I pushed my cart slowly down the aisle. I'm just busy. Gotcha. She hesitated, then added, Did you see his messages? Yes. Okay. The conversation ended a few minutes later. Nothing dramatic happened. No argument. No accusation. Still, something about it stayed with me. I couldn't remember the last time my delayed response had become a topic of discussion. Apparently, people noticed. Quickly. By Sunday evening, the situation felt impossible to ignore, not because anyone was yelling, because everyone seemed uncomfortable with waiting. I started noticing how much access people expected to have. To my attention, my availability, my wallet. If a message arrived, a response was expected. If a problem appeared, a solution was expected. If money was needed, a decision was expected. And usually, all of that happened immediately. I had spent years thinking I was simply helpful. Now I was starting to wonder whether I'd trained everyone, including myself, to believe I would always be available, no matter what. Monday morning brought another message from Jason, then another later that afternoon. I still hadn't answered. Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted everything to go back to normal, but another part kept thinking about the spreadsheet, the screenshot, Mom's comment. 8 years of transactions, 8 years of assumptions. By Tuesday evening, even work couldn't distract me anymore. My phone buzzed while I was eating dinner. I looked down. Jason. Again. This time there wasn't a long explanation, no details, no friendly small talk. Just one sentence. Short, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. So, are you helping or not? I stared at Jason's message for a long time. So, are you helping or not? A year earlier, maybe even 6 months earlier, I would have sent the money immediately. No questions, no discussion. Problem solved. Instead, I typed something I honestly couldn't remember ever asking before. What's the plan if I can't help? The typing bubble appeared almost instantly, disappeared, appeared again. Then Jason replied, What do you mean? I mean, what's your backup plan? Several minutes passed. That alone felt unusual. Normally, these conversations moved fast. This one didn't. Eventually, he answered, I'll figure something out. I read the message twice. Not because it was rude, because it was the first time anyone had mentioned another option. I didn't send money that night. I also didn't say no. I simply left the conversation there. The following week brought more opportunities to test what happened when I stopped running on autopilot. Mom called about a home repair estimate. Normally, I would have asked how much it cost. Instead, I asked something different. Did you get multiple quotes? A pause. No. Why not? I haven't had time. Maybe start there. The conversation stumbled forward awkwardly. Not hostile, just unfamiliar. It felt like both of us were speaking a language we'd never used before. A few days later, Rachel mentioned another tuition expense. I asked whether she had spoken with the financial aid office. I was hoping to avoid that. Why? Because it's a hassle. I laughed softly. Most solutions are. She laughed too. But I noticed something interesting. When I didn't immediately offer money, the conversation continued. Ideas appeared. Alternatives appeared. Options appeared. For years, I had unintentionally skipped that entire part of the process. One Saturday afternoon, Jason called. His voice sounded irritated, not angry, just frustrated. You've been acting different. There it was, the first person to say it out loud. Different how? You ask a lot more questions now. I almost smiled. Questions are bad? No. A pause. Then. It's just weird. Weird? Not wrong, not unfair, just weird. The word stuck with me, because from his perspective, maybe it was weird. I'd spent years functioning like an emergency response team. Now I was behaving like a normal person. The adjustment wasn't comfortable for anyone, including me. That's the part people don't always understand. Setting boundaries didn't feel empowering every second. Sometimes it felt awful. There were evenings when I sat on my couch wondering whether I was becoming selfish, whether I was overreacting to the screenshot, whether I was punishing people who genuinely needed help. Those doubts showed up constantly. Then I would open the spreadsheet. The doubts never disappeared completely, but the facts helped. The records didn't tell me what to feel. They simply reminded me what had happened. Again, and again, and again. One evening, I had dinner with a coworker named Melissa. We weren't close friends, just coworkers who occasionally grabbed food after work. At one point, she asked why I seemed distracted lately. I almost gave the usual answer: busy, work, stress. Instead, I surprised myself and told her a shortened version of the situation. Not everything, just enough. She listened quietly, then asked a question nobody in my family had ever asked. What happens if you stop? I laughed, a little nervously. That's kind of what I'm trying to figure out. No, she said. What happens to you? That question stayed with me long after dinner ended, because for years, every conversation had focused on what happened to everyone else. Very few focused on what happened to me. Back at home, I opened my spreadsheet again, then the screenshot, then my notes. For the first time, I wasn't just reviewing history, I was thinking about next steps, real steps, not emotional reactions, not arguments, not revenge, something practical, something organized, something I could stand behind months later and still know was the right decision. The next morning, during a break at work, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a financial advisor. The second was to an attorney. Both appointments were scheduled before lunch. When the confirmation emails arrived in my inbox, I sat quietly for a moment looking at them. Because for the first time since Aunt Linda's screenshot appeared on my phone, I wasn't gathering information anymore. I was preparing to do something with it. The financial advisor surprised me, not because of what she said, because of what she didn't say. I walked into the meeting expecting some dramatic reaction. Maybe she'd tell me I was being taken advantage of. Maybe she'd tell me to cut everyone off immediately. Maybe she'd look at my spreadsheets and act shocked. None of that happened. She spent nearly an hour reviewing my records. As she flipped through the pages, she occasionally nodded and asked questions. Then she set everything down. You're very organized. I laughed. Occupational hazard. I can tell. For a moment, she looked at the totals again. Then she asked, what outcome are you hoping for? The question caught me off guard. I don't know. Do you want repayment? No. The answer came immediately. I didn't even have to think about it. I wasn't interested in collecting money. I wasn't interested in punishment. I wasn't interested in proving a point. I just wanted the pattern to stop. She nodded. That makes this simpler. It didn't feel simple, but I understood what she meant. The conversation wasn't really about money anymore. It was about expectations, responsibilities, boundaries. For the first time in weeks, someone was helping me think about the future instead of dissecting the past. A few days later, I met with the attorney. That meeting felt even less dramatic. He reviewed documents, asked practical questions, made notes, then leaned back in his chair. You're not trying to recover funds? No. You're not threatening legal action? Absolutely not. He smiled. Then this is mostly a communication issue. A communication issue. 8 years of financial support reduced to 3 words. Oddly enough, that helped, because it removed some of the emotion. I wasn't preparing for a battle, I was preparing for a conversation. A difficult one, but still a conversation. Over the following weeks, I started building a plan. Not an emotional plan, not a revenge plan, a transition plan. 60 days. Long enough for people to adjust. Long enough for everyone to understand what was changing. Short enough that the situation wouldn't drag on forever. I created timelines, lists, deadlines. The same way I would manage a major payroll transition at work. Everything clear. Everything documented. No surprises. The process felt strangely calming. For the first time since seeing the screenshot, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. One evening, while reviewing my notes, an envelope arrived in the mail. I already knew what it was before opening it. My mother's retirement celebration. The date had been discussed for months. Family, friends, former coworkers, neighbors. A big gathering. Exactly the kind of event Mom loved. Inside was a formal invitation and a handwritten note. Hope you'll say a few words. Love, Mom. I read it twice, then set it on the table. For the next several days, I tried not to think about it. Unfortunately, everyone else was thinking about it. Rachel called to ask if I was attending. Jason mentioned it during a conversation. Even Aunt Linda brought it up. Your mom's excited, she said. I'm sure she is. You speaking? Probably. Linda was quiet for a second, then simply said, That was all. No advice, no warning. Just that one small sound. The closer the event got, the more I worked on my transition plan. The folders became cleaner. The records became more complete. Every figure was verified. Every payment documented. Not because I wanted to embarrass anyone, because I wanted facts. Facts were harder to argue with. One Saturday afternoon, I sat at my dining table surrounded by spreadsheets, folders, and notes. Beside them sat the retirement invitation. I looked from one to the other, then back again. Something clicked. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a simple realization. For years, whenever I tried discussing responsibilities, people changed the subject. Whenever I suggested planning, the conversation disappeared. Whenever I brought up long-term solutions, nobody wanted to engage. But the retirement party would be different. For one reason, everyone would be there. Mom, Jason, Rachel, extended family. People who had heard pieces of the story for years, people who rarely sat in the same room at the same time. I picked up the invitation again, then opened a blank document on my laptop. Because for the first time, I started wondering whether this celebration might be the only moment when everyone would actually stay long enough to listen. The retirement party was bigger than I expected. Family members filled the room. Old coworkers stood near the buffet tables. Neighbors drifted between conversations. Everywhere I looked, people were smiling and laughing. Mom looked genuinely happy. For a while, I almost talked myself out of what I planned to do. Almost. I carried my folder with me the entire evening. Nobody paid much attention to it. Why would they? I was the organized one, the one who handled things. At one point, Mom squeezed my arm. I'm so glad you're here. Wouldn't miss it. She smiled. So many years went by so fast. I nodded. They really had. A little later, someone tapped a glass. The room quieted. A few short speeches came first. Then someone called my name. Mom smiled proudly as I walked to the front. The room expected a tribute, and part of what I gave was exactly that. I talked about Mom, about how hard she worked after Dad died, about the sacrifices she made for all of us. People nodded. Mom wiped at her eyes. Then I opened the folder. I want to share something else tonight. A few confused looks appeared. I kept my voice calm. No anger, no accusations. Just facts. For the last 8 years, I've helped support our family financially. Nobody interrupted. I talked about mortgage payments, tuition, insurance, repairs, medical bills. The reality was simple. Temporary help had quietly become a long-term arrangement. The room felt different. Jason stopped smiling. Rachel stared at the table. Mom looked uncertain. Then I reached the part I had rehearsed dozens of times. I'm not asking for repayment. A few heads lifted. I'm not asking for apologies. Silence. But I am making a change. My hands were steady. That surprised me, because inside I was terrified. I've created a 60-day transition period. After that, I won't be providing ongoing financial support. The room went completely still. Then someone asked, "You're serious?" Yes. Jason looked stunned. Mom looked embarrassed. Rachel looked uncomfortable. Some people seemed angry. Others just looked shocked. What stood out most was that nobody questioned the support itself, only the fact that it was ending. I thanked everyone for listening, closed the folder, and stepped away. The argument started almost immediately. Questions, protests, confused conversations. I didn't stay for them. I found Mom near one of the tables. "You really planned all this," she said quietly. "Yes." She looked down. "I wish you had talked to me first." The words stung, because I had tried. For years. But this wasn't the place for that conversation, so I simply nodded. "I know." Then I hugged her goodbye and left. The drive home felt strangely quiet, like I'd finally set down something I'd been carrying for years. The next few months weren't easy. There were angry calls, awkward conversations, periods of silence. A few relatives stopped contacting me altogether, but life kept moving. And something unexpected happened. People adapted. Jason picked up additional work. Rachel adjusted her budget and worked with financial aid. Mom reorganized her household expenses. None of it was easy. None of it was perfect. But they managed. The thing I had feared most never happened. Nobody collapsed. Nobody was destroyed by the absence of my money. They figured things out. Meanwhile, my own life started looking different. I took a vacation I had postponed for years, started saving for goals that actually belonged to me, spent weekends doing things that weren't crisis management. At first it felt strange. Then it started feeling normal. Months later, I was sitting in a park with my niece Olivia. She was eating ice cream and talking about school. At one point, she looked at me and said, "You're happier now." I laughed. "What makes you think that?" She shrugged. "You smile more." Then she went right back to her story. Simple, matter of fact. I watched her for a moment. Not every relationship survived that year. Some people stayed distant. Some things never fully healed. But the people who remained in my life stayed for reasons that had nothing to do with money. And sitting there with Olivia, I realized something I never would have believed before. The boundary I was most afraid to set ended up protecting every relationship that was worth keeping. Have you ever had to set a boundary with someone you loved, even knowing it might change the relationship forever? Let me know in the comments. I'd genuinely like to hear your experience.